All right. I was all upset then. I was waiting to see my face. It's just you. Clearly, I'm not as important as the man himself. Hi everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jermaine Foster. I am a radio presenter, a producer who lives here in the city. You might have noticed from my accent, I'm not officially from Liverpool. I am from Birmingham, but I've lived here longer, so I call myself a scrummy, half Scouse, half Bro. All right. So, following on from the great success of previous festivals, we are all delighted to welcome you to the internationally renowned Writers to the City as well. The festival's main sponsors are, of course, Student Roost and Bruntwood, and we're grateful for their support also. I will ask you at the end of our Q&A if you can wait for Malik to leave the room first so he can get downstairs, get to where his book letters to Gil are, and then he can sign them for you on your way out. But that will be near the end as well. And also at the end, if you do want to ask any questions, there are two people here with microphones. They'll be going around the room at the end to hand the microphone to you so you don't have to shout across the room. Make sense? Fantastic. All right then, so if anyone has never met this fantastic gentleman before, allow me to introduce him. His name is Malik Al Nasir. He is a performance poet, he's a filmmaker, he's a writer, he's a musician, a producer as well. He's got a remarkable, very interesting life. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Malik a few times actually, and we're going to hear about his journey as to where it is now. Also his book, do you want to model it for us? Look at this, there it is. His book, Letters to Gil, is something that we're going to talk about as well. His life changed when he had an encounter with a very legendary poet by the name of Gil Scott-Heron. Maybe you may have heard of him. If not, you'll learn a bit more about him very shortly. You also have a bachelor's degree, a master's, and you're currently working on a PhD at Cambridge. Not bad at all. Yeah. Yes. I have none of those things. So, Malik, why don't you say hello to everyone before we...
Hi, everyone, and thank you all for coming out today. It's a real pleasure to be here at my old alma mater, one of them anyway. I did graduate from here with my postgraduate diploma back in, I think, 2000, there or thereabouts. So it's nice to be back here today and to be, you know, part of Liverpool.
Does it feel weird being back here?
It does, because in this actual building, I attended a lecture. But what I didn't know until today was that they used to hold autopsies here. And apparently they used to wheel the dead bodies in from there, which is our green room. So I am told that the room is in fact haunted. So I won't be staying very long at the end. So I do encourage everyone to come down and sign, you know, get me to sign a copy of the book before I have to scoot off before night falls and the ghosts arrive.
If anyone is familiar with Malik's story, you'll know already, like I know, that there is so many chapters in Malik's. It's difficult to kind of get through it all, so we'll kind of do our best to cover as much things as we can. We'd always like to start kind of from the beginning. Malik, your story, it didn't start in care, but a lot of your journey kind of began around that time. When was it that you got taken from was it your mother you were living with, right? Your mother?
Yeah,
got taken from your mum and then moved into care?
So in the beginning there was sound and someone said, let there be light. No, it was 1974 initially when my father, who was a Guyanese seaman, had a stroke and became a quadriplegic. And he went off to hospital to become what they call then a geriatric patient. So he was, once you're in there as a geriatric ward, you don't come out. He would come home occasionally at the weekends, but in an ambulance. But he was a quadriplegic. He was paralyzed from the neck downwards. So he was sort of out of our lives from that point, and that's really where things took a downhill spiral for us. So my mum was sort of struggling to cope with 4 kids. She's a white woman with 4 black kids in Netherlands at this point. You know, so there's like 100,000 white families and 4 black families. So, you know, I thought nigger was my name. And that was just the reality of life, and, you know, sticks and stones and so on. And, you know, you go into the school assembly hall and, you know, black Sambo, living in the jungle alone, except for big black mumbo and big black jumbo. And that's the headmaster with a reel-to-reel tape playing that to the children in the school. And then you're like, yeah, black Sambo. You know, and this is like 10 little nigger boys are still on the curriculum and so on. So, you know, fights were happening. We were being attacked on a daily basis. It was incredibly hostile for us. And as a result, you know, we were always getting into trouble, and then the social services were called in, and my mum was having to fight off the social services, but they were going to the school, and the school was saying, yeah, these kids are troublemakers, and, you know, because we always seemed to be in the sort of, on where the trouble nexus was, we were like, you know, gyrated on us kind of thing. So the social workers eventually just stepped in 1975 and took me into care. So that was the beginning of what was to be a very traumatic rest of my childhood for the next 9 years.
I mean, at that time when you were kind of getting that treatment from school and, you know, from the head teacher and stuff like that, did you kind of understand, were you old enough to understand what was being sung, what was being shouted, what was actually going on?
Well, yeah, because my father was kind of like a bit of a black nationalist. You know, he was into Malcolm X, he loved Muhammad Ali, he was Garvey, you know, all that kind of stuff. He used to be a sort of a central figure within the Guyanese community, because he's from what was previously British Guyana. It was independence in '66, the year I was born, and then became the Republic of Guyana. But, you know, my father was born in like 1918, so, you know, slavery was still in Cuba and Brazil until 1880. So, you know, you know, my grandfather's generation had slavery in living memory. So my father was very, you know, staunch in his beliefs that you should never allow yourself to be subjugated. And he would say to me things like, you know, my name was Mark at that time. I converted to Islam and changed my name to Malik years later. But he would say to me, you know, Mark, or they used to call me Spartacus. That was my nickname. All Guyanese have nicknames, by the way. So at 3, I was Spartacus, you know, the revolutionary. Who knew? So he said, like, you know, Spartacus, you know, never be an Uncle Tom. And I would say, you know, Daddy, what's an Uncle Tom? He said, a white man's bootlicker. So I was told that from childhood, you know. But then I'm in a situation where I'm constantly being told, go back to where you came from. You know, you're not welcome here, you know. Jump back on your jam jar. I had one kid one time, he's walking home with this kid and his dad. And his dad and the kid started laughing to one another and making some kind of joke, and I overheard what they were saying. He said, you know, your friend's got a disease. And he was like, what's the disease? He said, he's suffering from jam jar-geritis. He needs to get back on his jam jar. So this is parents coming home with 2 little kids from school saying this to his own son about his son's friend. And they didn't see anything wrong in that. So, you know, I'm coming home and trying to contextualize all this racial stuff. That's just the barrage of it that's coming at me and my siblings on a daily basis. And my dad was breaking it down for us, like what it was and what we shouldn't do. So I had a very sense, you know, from a very early age that you should resist, that you should fight back, that you shouldn't just take it. But it was overwhelming. And then suddenly, you know, at 8 years old, my dad's gone. You know, he's in hospital. There's no one to defend us. My mum's white. She doesn't understand. And no one else understands. So at that point, we were very much alone in dealing with this. There was no going to the teacher to complain. The same teacher who's playing Black Sambo in the jungle on the reel-to-reel in the assembly hall, there was nowhere to go. You know, so I think what started there was a kind of conditioning to just resign yourself to the reality that you were living in a very racist situation that was unlikely to change for you, and you just had to survive it.
And then, you know, you said there you moved into care. That was when you were 9.
1975, I was taken into care, yeah, at the age of 9.
And then the treatment of what you had in care, that didn't really change too much, did it? Like, your time
It was
in care
brutal.
was tough.
It was brutal. I mean, my reception into care in 1975 was to be taken by the social worker, and I described this in the book. in very kind of visceral terms. And there's an audiobook version of this as well, which I narrate, where you can hear this, where, you know, she takes me in her little car, this little green, what they call a hill. The older ones will remember the Hillman Imp. Yeah? Little green Hillman Imp with a beige leather interior. Now, why do I even remember that? Because that was the night that my world changed. That was the night that everything I knew ceased to be what it was. That was the night that I was no longer my mother's son. I was now about to be a ward of the state. So my freedom was taken away from me on that night. So even the smell of that leather, the look of that sort of hippie social worker, and the name of that car, the color of that car, the color of the interior, all stuck in my mind, because it was probably the single most traumatic event that I'd experienced up until that point. And I was taken to Acrefield Road in Woolton, to what was some mansion house that belonged to a sugar baron, Henry Tate, who actually built this building. Henry Tate paid for this. There's a plaque on the, if you walk through into the quad, there's a plaque on the side here to Henry Tate. He gifted this building to the university, but he also built the building on Acrefield Road in Woolton for his daughter when she got married, and some kind of way it got passed down to City Council, and they made it into a children's home called the Liverpool Children's Admission Unit, or also known as the Woolton Admission Unit. And I was received in there on the night that I was taken into care. I was stripped, showered, put in these striped pajamas, led to a room in total silence, and then locked in that room for 14 days and nights with bars on the windows, in solitary confinement at the age of 9.
9 years old.
That was my reception into local authority care.
I mean, we'll talk a bit later about, you know, the kind of way you kind of dealt with that, because you were able later to kind of pull them up on those type of things.
I sued them.
Yeah.
And I won.
We'll get there. Did the treatment in terms of race change at all while you were in care?
No, that was prevalent within the society at the time. You know, Bernard Manning was like, you know, Chubby Brown with all the, you know, chalky and nigger jokes and whatever. It was normal in the society. No one saw it as abnormal. Like the nature, I mean, there's no disrespect to the white people in the audience. You know, it's not your fault you're white. I mean, you know, so please don't take offense at any of this. But my mum's white. I know a lot of white people. Some of my best friends are white.
Sorry, that was brilliant.
So, just saying.
That was really funny.
So, you know, when all this stuff was going on, it was almost as if white people felt that they had the absolute right to call us niggers, and it was their inherent, you know, privilege to be able to do so. And we should not believe that there was anything wrong with that. We should not be offended by that. And if we were offended by it, we had a chip on our shoulders. And this was another thing, chip on the shoulder. You know, I used to think, what the hell is this chip on the shoulder thing that they're going on about? Because any time they call me a nigger and I say something about it, I've got a chip on my shoulder. In fact, I summed it up in a poem. Can I recite a poem, please?
Do.
I'll stand up because I can breathe better when I'm doing that. Is that all right? Do you like poetry, you guys? Okay. So this poem was one that I wrote called Freedom is a Funny Thing, and it was about the concept of freedom, what we consider to be freedom, and the kind of dichotomy between what we believe to be freedom and what freedom actually represented to me. Freedom is a funny thing. We all believe that it can be. But dreams of youths in poverty, when shattered by reality, make me question our democracy. I ask, are we truly free? If so, then freedom is a funny thing. Freedom is a funny thing. Ha ha, you think not so, I say. To freedom we must find a way. You're free, they say. Why can't you see? Long gone are chains of slavery. This is a free democracy. We're both as equals, you and me. If so, I say, we're neither free. Because you talk about democracy and equal rights for blacks and whites, but in your eyes I see the truth. Your drunken mouth provides the proof. There's chips on shoulders, I agree, but fry your own before you fry me, because I'm aware of your contempt for everyone except yourself. I'm just another category not welcome in your bigotry. For all your views and flattery, I clearly see your contempt for me. But if the skin that you wear was black, not fair, you'd suffer inequality. You'd hate so-called democracy. You'd writhe in pains of poverty. If bigots said, why can't you see, and told you that you're truly free, you'd stare them right between the eyes, and from your soul I'd hear the cries, God help this damn democracy. Why can't there be equality? Won't anyone just listen to me, Lord? When can we be truly free? When from your race you've been outcast, you're scared and hungry and on your ass. A song of freedom I would sing. Now, isn't freedom a funny thing?
You know, this is, of course, a literacy festival. You know, your time, you told us you got put into care at 9. Mm-hmm. Already in school, you were having a tough time. Mm-hmm. I'm sure people have read the bio before coming in here. You were semi-literate.
When I came out of care.
When you came out of care. So was there any education at the time? Was they making sure that you were going to school? Or?
They had what they called community homes with education on the premises. But once you went into the care system, you were essentially persona non grata. No key performance indicators, no milestones. You weren't going to sit any qualifications. You didn't go to an outside school. No one was asking, where is he, why isn't he, da-da-da-da, as you would be if you were in a normal school. You didn't sit exams and you didn't take qualifications. So they would have these classrooms, like one place I was for 4.5 years in Warrington called Greystone Heath. They had a farm. So even though they had these 7 classrooms where they would group you together, apparently based on IQ rather than based on age. So as a 9-year-old, I could be in the same class as a 15, 16-year-old. But the level of education that they were giving you was rudimentary at best. And it was not leading to anything. You weren't going to sit any exams. You weren't going to be tested. There was none of that. So for the most part, they just worked us on the farm. They considered it to be, you're going to give you something that's going to be useful to you in later life because you're maladjusted. So, therefore, what do you need an education for? So to give you an example of some of the things they used to do, they used to have this thing called bastard trenching. So bastard trenching, because it was a bastard to do, would be a patch of land the size of a probably football field. And the kids would all line up and they would stake it out at both ends with string and these metal stakes, the ones they use on building sites, to make a straight line. And then we would dig a 2-foot trench all the way along from one end to the other. And then the staves would move forward a couple of feet and then we'd dig another one. And we would do that right the way through this whole thing. And then the group up behind would come along with potatoes, plant the potatoes, and then fill out the trenches and, the mounds. And we would grow potatoes and they would sell them. And that's what we'd do when most other kids were in school. It was child slave labor. So then the farmer decided he wanted to build some greenhouses to grow tomatoes. So they brought these dumper trucks with hardcore, rubble off building sites, bricks. And we dug out this whole place, probably about, I would say about the length of this room from one end to the other, maybe about 4 meters, 5 meters wide. And we dug it all out, leveled it, put railway sleepers around the side of it to measure it all out. And they come with these dumper trucks and they dump this hardcore into there. And then they gave all the kids these little ball peen hammers. And we had to smash the hardcore down into gravel, from bricks into gravel. So it took us weeks to do that. And then once it was all done, we had to rake it off. And then we had to mix cement. And then they laid the foundations for the greenhouse. And then the farmer grew tomatoes and sold the tomatoes. They had an orchard, which was about 2 acres, which had apples and pear trees. We'd have to climb the trees, collect the apples and pears, and they made cider, and they sold it. So we received nothing from the produce of what they were doing. Your breakfast in the morning would be a tinned tomato, a half a slice of fried bread, and a slice of bacon. That would be your breakfast, and then a cup of tea. And then you would go out and work 6-7 hours on the farm on that meager ration in order to be able to develop skills that would be beneficial and relevant in society. So one day the farmer decided he wanted a bowling green, and there was an area outside the classrooms it was like what we used to call an oller. Does anyone ever remember the oller? Going and playing on the oller, yeah? It's probably like a really Liverpool word. I don't think it's actually a proper word. But I did look, there's a dictionary, there is a sort of a cultural, one of those dictionaries that they have for words that are not in the lexicon yet, but they really should be, and Ola is, in fact, technically a word. But it's just a piece of wasteland, so he wanted to level it. So what he would do is he would get us all out there. We had to dig it over first with the spades, and then when we finished digging it over, he would get a railway sleeper, the things what they used to put the railway lines on, and then he would put a rope around each side of it, and then 6 of us would pull the rope on one end, another 6 on the other end, and then 4 of us would stand on the sleeper and pull the others to level it so we could have a bowling green because he liked to bowl. So this is what I was doing when I was supposed to be in school. So at the age of 18, they dumped me in a homeless hostel in Liverpool. I've been completely removed from my family at this point. Me and my mum don't speak. We don't even know what to say to each other. I'm disparate from my siblings. We've got no real bond or connection because we haven't formed any, because we haven't really grown up together. I'm dumped in a place, far from, where the rest of the family are. In Toxteth, the family are all still in Netherley. And I'm in this hostel for homeless black youths called Ujama House. And a social worker who I'd never met turned up at 18 years old on my 18th birthday with a form and 100 quid. He said, there's 100 quid. Sign this form to say that you'll never come back to social services for any more. Okay? And congratulations, you're now officially out of care. And I was abandoned in this homeless hostel. So at that point, I was semi-literate because I just hadn't had any course to read. No one had ever given me a book and said, read the book. No one had ever set me down and said, okay, come on, now we're going to do reading or whatever. We were farming. I was milking goats and, extracting honey with a centrifuge and picking apples and smashing rocks and digging trenches. So we missed the entirety of education. I think I had a couple of periods when I went home on trial and they broke down because they put me in a school and I just couldn't cope in the school because they put me in science classes, never studied science, French, didn't know nothing about French. They put me in the second year when I was a third year because it was a lower level and I still couldn't cope at that level because I'd never done the first year. I never finished primary school. I missed 18 months of primary school and I only had 18 months of secondary school. And the 18 months of secondary school was totally traumatic because I didn't understand hardly anything of what was going on.
Yeah. I mean, some of you are probably thinking now, you're like, didn't Jermaine say in the intro that Malik's got a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD? How does he have all these things if he was semi-literate?
Well, I haven't got the PhD yet. I'm in my final year.
That's because you're semi-literate, mate. But your life did take a big turn when you met someone who, obviously, like a very important, very special person in your life. The person who the letters were in on your book. The book is called Letters to Gil. So for anyone who isn't too familiar with Gil Scott-Heron, how would you describe him as somebody who knew him so well?
Well, people think of Gil Scott-Heron as a musician. People think of him, he's called the godfather of rap because his album that came out in 1971, which is now regarded as proto-rap or pre-rap, was really taking poetry and putting it over tribal drum beats, was really among the very early examples of what we today call rap and hip-hop, which evolved out of it. So, Chuck D said without Gil Scott-Heron there would be no Public Enemy. So I would describe Gil, though, as an activist first and foremost. Yeah, he was a musician. Yeah, he was a poet. Yeah, he was a writer. He dropped out of Johns Hopkins University in his first year to write his first novel, The Vulture, which came out in 1970. And then by 1971, he'd written and put out his second novel, and then went on to produce an album, which the song "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" became an iconic piece of work that if anyone plays games, which I think probably a lot of the audience maybe don't, but in Grand Theft Auto, you'll find "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" in the soundtrack. It was used in the soundtrack to the Black Panther movie. It was used in the soundtrack to the Long Walk to Freedom, the Nelson Mandela movie. It's been on Nike commercials. It's been sampled by just about everyone who was ever in hip-hop. And it's kind of, people regard it as the kind of Rosetta Stone of hip-hop, the thing that makes it all make sense, the cipher, if you like. But I always describe Gil first and foremost as an activist because he was born in Chicago in late 1949, and his mother was married to Gil Heron Sr., who was a soccer player, as they call it in America, football player, and he got offered to play for Celtic. And he left America to go to Scotland to play for Celtic. So he's Celtic's first black football player, Gil Scott-Heron Senior. They call him the Black Arrow. But the mother was like with the child, and she couldn't cope on her own, so she took the child to her mother down south in Jackson, Tennessee. And he grew up in Jackson with his grandmother. And he wrote a poem about it years later, so Coming from a Broken Home, which came out on his last album in 2010 before he passed away in 2011. And this experience that he had down south, he was close to Memphis, so they could pick up all the blues that were coming in from the radio station. His grandma lived next door to a funeral parlor, and they had a piano in the funeral parlor that they used to play when they were, having the wakes and so on. And when the funeral parlor closed, they were going to throw it in the skip, and the grandmother gave the guy $2 and wheeled the piano into the house, and Gil started to learn to play piano. But she didn't like him playing the blues because that was the devil's music, Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil, all that sort of stuff. She was a church woman, so what he would do is when she was around, he'd play church music, and when she wasn't, he'd play the blues. He later went on to describe himself as a bluesologist, concerned primarily with the science of the blues. And he always said, if you wanted to make something scientific, just put an ology on the end of it. So that was Gil, but he engaged with a lot of activist causes because if anyone's familiar with the education system in America, obviously it was segregated up until a famous Supreme Court case called Brown versus Board of Education. So everyone's familiar, I'm sure, with the Roe v. Wade case that's going on in America now and the abortion thing. So Brown versus Board of Education was the equivalent for desegregation. It was the thing that said that you couldn't have segregated schools anymore. The idea of separate but equal had not worked, because the black community schools, while separate, were certainly not equal to the ones in the white community. So therefore, it was the landmark case desegregated the schools in the South. So what they started to do then was look at the demography of the school areas and realize that there were no black people in the white areas because of Jim Crow segregation. So they said, fine, we'll bus black kids into white areas and force the white schools to take them. So this busing started, and that caused all kinds of chaos in America. You'll see pictures of a little black girl about 10 years old clutching her school books, and she's got the roadway lined with state troopers as she's trying to get into the white school, and the KKK are burning a cross on the lawn and, trying to stop the desegregation of the schools. So Gil was one of those kids that was bused to those schools. So he had that real first-hand experience of what it was when Jim Crow was being, dismantled, that segregation in the South. And it was some years before he then moved to New York and then later to DC, where he was more, got exposed to like the city life. So Gil had a really good understanding of the North-South divide, what was going on, the Jim Crow segregation, and also the city life, harsh realities of being in a place like New York. And he wove all of that into the narratives in his poems and also in his books as well. So he'd started to align with a lot of causes. He was very much involved with the cause, the anti-apartheid cause. So he was one of the artists united against apartheid, which led to the Free Mandela movement, which freed Mandela, which led to the end of apartheid. He was one of the musicians united for safe energy, and they did albums to try and stop the spread of nuclear armaments and the use of nuclear power. He got behind a lot of causes, like the cause of Gary Tyler, who was a black guy who was accused falsely of killing a white person and went to jail in the Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana, where he probably, I think to this day, he's still there. But there was a campaign. I think people who know the UB40 song, Tyler is Guilty, the White Judge Said So, that's based on Gary Tyler's life. So Gil did a song about that, and he was working with the beat poets as well in terms of trying to raise consciousness about anti-war stuff, So there was a whole range of causes. So if you ask me who Gil Scott-Heron was, yes, he was a musician, yes, he was a poet, yes, he was an author, but first and foremost, he was an activist.
I mean, he sounds like, obviously he was an awesome, really, cool guy. Ed sounds quite well educated, a poet, and all these type of things. How does somebody like that then not only meet you, but then become really good friends with you?
He was like a father to me.
How did that encounter come across?
Because Gil was like he'd received fame, he'd made all his money, you know, he'd done really, really well in his career. But he was not like the average person who does well. The average person who does well puts themselves in an ivory tower because they're more scared about someone coming along and taking what they've got, you know? So they go and live in the suburbs where the poor people can't get at them, or they, you know, they get in an office and they're behind layers of secretaries and gatekeepers, you know, where people can't, you know, contact them, and they become aloof because, you know, they're afraid, you know, I'm in this position, if someone comes along, they might take it away from me, or they might, you know, come and take what I've got, or they might rob me, or they might, you know, do whatever. So there's all this levels of things to keep you out as people go up the pyramid. So Gil was the complete antithesis of that. He was accessible at every level. He could go and talk to the politicians. We used to have diplomats coming to the shows and everything backstage and taking us off to the diplomatic residences after the gig for parties and all that kind of stuff. But the same, he could go down in the community and be talking to the kids on the street, you know, and he did that everywhere he went. He made a point of making himself accessible to the people because he considered himself like almost like a ghetto reporter, like someone who was traveling from place to place to place, taking the sort of big, complex issues of the day, the geopolitics of the world, whether it was Bear Pigs invasion, Watergate scandal, you know, big, whatever was going on, you know, re-election of Ronald Reagan, the special relationship with Margaret Thatcher and all that. He was taking those things, but he was distilling them down into simplistic, you know, poems and couplets that could be delivered to ordinary people in a way that they could understand, in a way that, you know, that the BBC wasn't doing. He was given a perspective, he was given an angle on the big issues of the day that we could relate to, that wasn't sort of being imposed upon us through a sort of post-colonialist lens where we're all expected to look at it the way middle-class white people who commission programs say we should look at it, and that was what was happening at the time. So, so people, when he came to Liverpool, obviously we'd made global headlines in '81 with the Toxteth riots. Every major news outlet in the world was here in Liverpool reporting live from the Toxteth riots. And he was aware, but because he was touring, he had the ability to go to Toxteth now and find out for himself. So when he arrived in 1984 to perform at the Royal Court Theatre here, he was met by the Liverpool 8 Black Caucus, which had been formed out of the Toxteth riots. So there was a group of individual activists and some black organisations that had sort of come up, the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee, and different people who'd come up during the riots, and they'd formed this caucus in order to try and have their demands met, in order for them to try and articulate their issues. And they met with Gil before the show at soundcheck, and he'd sat down, and even on the night he wore their Black Caucus t-shirt to show affinity with them. And they were feeling as though they hadn't been heard. Margaret Thatcher was in power. I mean, Margaret Thatcher came to Liverpool, stood in the Liverpool Town Hall, you know, when Dame Margaret Simey started trying to articulate what was going on, she was like, who is that woman? You know, she wasn't interested. She told Michael Heseltine to put Liverpool into managed decline. They didn't want to do anything. Thatcher was completely averse to doing anything beneficial. I mean, she smashed the dockers, she smashed the miners. You know, Liverpool was in a terrible state at that time in general, and the black people in Liverpool were at the very bottom of that pile, you know. So Gil, having met with the Black Caucus to hear their concerns, already had this affiliation, if you like, that he now had a direct connection with the black community here that wasn't being filtered through the BBC or CNN or any of these other big outlets. And as a consequence of that, I think when I got backstage that night and met him, because I snuck in, there was a photographer who had a backstage pass, and she got me in, because I didn't have no money, you know, I just turned up at the gig, and she got me back in, and then suddenly I'm in the press pit at the front, so I've got prime vantage point, watching the show with backstage access, you know. And, you know, I got backstage, and you know, the door flung open, and there he was, and all these promoters, like, you know, bags of money, and band trying to get paid, and reporters with microphones, and everyone wanted something from him. And I could just see the man he had a towel around his neck, he was sweating cobs, he'd give his all on the stage, and they still wanted something from us, like we could suck the lifeblood out of his veins, you know, leave the man alone. And this is what's going on in my little 18-year-old head. But I'm destitute, I'm homeless, I'm poor, I've got holes in my shoes, you know, you know, at this point I had nothing, you know, I couldn't even read and write properly. But still, you know, I thought, I want to give this guy something. I don't know what to give him. I just want to give him something. So I thought, I've got nothing to give other than compliments, but I don't want to take anything from him. So I just walked over to him and I shook his hand. I thanked him. I told him I was really, moved by his performance. It was wonderful what he'd done for us, and really appreciate it. And I turned to leave. And then he just said, "Hey, brother, I heard you all had some riots around here. You want to tell me about it?" So I was like, "Okay." So we started talking about the riots, and then people filtered off here and there, and then it got to the point where the band were like getting ushered out by the promoters. And he said, "Why don't you come on back to the hotel with us?" He said, "Pick up some drums or something." So I'm like, "Okay." So I pick up some drums and I'm walking out now and load them on the back of the van. And he says, "Come on, get on the bus and come with us." And that was like just a moment. That was the pivotal moment which changed my entire life when he said, "Get on the bus and come with us." And I even did a song later on where I sample his voice saying that when he's telling the story in an interview about me to someone else. And that was it. And then we got back to the hotel, and some journalists did some interviews or whatever. And then he said, "I want to see the place for myself." He said, "Can you take me and show me like where the riots happened?" So I said, "Sure." So we got the promoter, and all the band had gone back to the hotel, and we got on the bus, and the next thing is just me, Gil, and the promoter driving around Liverpool, giving him a running commentary of like Parliament Street and Lodge Lane, and showing him all the burnt out buildings and the Charles Wotton, and all the landmarks, the Rialto and the places. Some of them were still, you could still see the damage at that point from the riots. And then he said, "Look, we've got a day off tomorrow. Why don't you come down?" I said, "Well, let me do something for you. Let me cook a meal for you." He said, "Well, who should I bring?" I said, "Well, just bring everyone." So I'm thinking then, he agreed, and I thought, okay, hell, I'm living in a homeless hostel, like I'm skint, you know what I mean? But anyone remember cashing your gyro? Remember getting the gyro? We used to get the dole money in those days, used to get a gyro check, take it to the post office. So I was getting my gyro the next day. So I think I got like £16 or a week or whatever, so £32 to be gyro. Cashed my gyro, and then basically went down and bought a big load of food. And my friend Dobbo, I said to him, he had a flat on Devonshire Road. I was like, "Can I borrow your flat?" He was like, "Yeah, sure." So I cooked all the food and took it to the flat, and then the bus came with the band, and apart from the saxophone player, everyone came. So he was like, "No, I'm just going to stay in my room and blow my sax." We became great friends afterwards, Ron Holloway. He then left Gil to play for Dizzy Gillespie until Dizzy died. But anyway, that was Ron. He just always wanted to play sax. But the rest of them all came. So, I'm laying out this big spread for them and everything. We had a lovely evening and everything, and the time comes for them to leave. And as they're leaving, Gil turned around to me with two £50 notes. Now, this is 1984, like, to an 18-year-old kid in a homeless hostel, like £50, like, that was a lot of money, but there was two of them, and I'd never seen a £50 note at that point. So he passed it to me, and I was like, "No, you're all right, man, I don't want your money." And he was like, No, take it. I was like, "No, I don't want it." So he stuffed it down my shirt. So I pulled it back out again, like ruffled notes, and rammed it into his pocket, and I was like, "I don't want your money." So he looked at me like this, as if to say, "Who is this guy?" So then he turned to the promoter and he said, "Look, we've got like, how long are we in Europe now? 2 weeks?" He said, "Yeah." So he said, "Well, when we come back, we're doing a full tour of the UK. Take his details. Contact him when we get back. I want him to come out on tour." He said, "Would you be willing to do that? Come on tour with us?" I was like, "Yeah, to do what?" He said, "Whatever the fuck you want, man." I was like, "Okay." So, okay. So, and that was it. I got on the bus and I toured with Gil, and that relationship carried on for the next 27 years until he passed away.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, and obviously that's led on to, in later life, this book that we have here now, Letters to Gil. It seems like an obvious question, but what were the letters that you were writing to Gil?
So my dad was a seaman for 35 years. At that time, like, everyone was a seaman or worked on the ferries or worked on the docks, pre-Thatcher, of course, because obviously she destroyed all of that. But, Liverpool revolved around the docks. So I had decided to follow in my father's footsteps and go away to sea. So I did a stint on the Isle of Man ferries in '84, that same year, and then used that to go away deep sea. So I worked on oil tankers, BP, Maersk, a couple of others, and then did another stint on the ferry. So all total, I did like 5 years at sea. So whilst I was at sea, I was traveling, obviously, around the world. Every place I got to in the world, I just started to do what Gil did. Go ashore, meet the people, wander off wherever, find out what was going on in the place, and then come back and then start like using poetry to teach myself to read and write, but using the substance of the places that I went to as the subject matter for what I was writing about. So I had loads of time on the ship because I was the only black person on the ship and I was completely ostracized. So on the tankers, for instance, my name on the ship was the Coon. That's what I was called. I wasn't addressed by my name. I was like, where's the coon? Oh, there he is. Yeah. So that was my name on the ship. So that was the level of racism on the ship. So I had a lot of time to myself on the ship. So I'd work from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. And then when you knock off at 6 at night, I'd have from 6 at night till midnight, where I would sit there and I would get a book and I would like literally be using my finger, breaking down the syllables, you know, and the man went to the, you know, and it was like that. And then I'd get to the end of the sentence and then I'd read the whole sentence again, having memorized some of the things that I'd broken down in syllables. And then I'd get to the end of the paragraph and read the whole paragraph again, get to the end of the chapter, read the whole chapter again, get to the end of the book and read the whole book again. So it would take me 6 months to read one book like that, 6 hours a night, 7 nights a week for the entirety of the 6 months. But then I started to get into the etymology of the words, how I could use the words, you know, the origins of the words, the applications of the words in different styles of writing, creative writing, prose, poetry, different meters, you know, and through that process, I became literate over that 5-year period. And the alternative was going about and get pissed with the racist seamen who hated me and wanted to throw me over the side. That wasn't really an option for me. So it was Hobson's choice. But I benefited from it because all the time I was there, I thought to myself, I'm not going to be here forever. You're still going to be here, and I'm going to go and progress somewhere else. This is a stepping stone for me. This is not an end point. So I utilized that time in order to be able to become literate with the hope that one day I would be able to go to college and university. So I had an opportunity with the Littlewoods organization because during the riots, John Moores, namesake of John Moores University, Mr. John as we called him, had the Littlewoods organization. There was the Littlewoods chain stores, massive retail chain across the country. They had the Littlewoods pools, their gambling concern where they'd made all their money. They had the index shops, they had Hitchens for their seconds. They had a whole range of things. It was just a massive multi-billion-pound company. And what is today the Plaza used to be the JM Centre, the John Moores Centre. And they had 3,000 people working in there. There was only like 2 of them were black. And they were probably on like reception or something. So John Moores had joined as an honorary member the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee. Okay? Because he was saying, look, these riots are going to hit town. When they hit town, they hit my business. We need to stop these riots. What can we do? So the whole business community in Liverpool kind of put him forward and went, he'll deal with the blacks, you know, go and deal with the natives and see if you can calm down, you know, what's going on in the jungle. You know, that was the sort of attitude. But John Moores was very sincere about what he did from what I could see and from what I know of him. And he launched, as a consequence of his involvement with the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee, he launched the very first Equal Opportunities Department in Britain, in the JM Centre on Old Hall Street. And he hired 2 people from the community, Linda Loy and Peter Bassi, and they put together a programme called Entry to Business, which would take on 4 black kids a year from Toxteth and train them in management and put them through a kind of generic store management training in a Littlewood store for 3 months, and then you'd have a 12-month period where you could be seconded to any part of the organisation and learn anything you wanted, and your salary would be paid from Equal Opportunities, not from the department that you were working in. But John Moores didn't get the support of the board at Littlewoods, so he paid for the whole thing out of his own pocket. I came back from sea, met with Linda Loy, and she was like, a place is coming available. I said, right, I'm going to do one more trip. When I come back, I'm going to apply for it. And I did, and I got the place. So John Moores paid for me to go to college to do a BTEC in business and finance. I did the first year of the BTEC. I got my notification of performance. I got distinction in 4 out of 5 subjects. But then when it came to giving me the job, and 15 months into the course, it's a day release program, so you got to do the 2 years to finish the BTEC. I couldn't finish the BTEC because no one internally would give me the job. So I couldn't progress, despite the fact that I'd been seconded to the Index store and I'd become the national marketing coordinator for Index nationwide. I was doing, you know, I was running all the promotions for their stores for like 120 stores. But they were happy to use me for free. They just weren't happy to take me on and pay me. So I left with half a BTEC. Okay? But that half a BTEC, when I turned up at Hope University and said, look, I want to come and do a degree. Obviously, what qualifications have you got? Well, I've got a notice of performance from my BTEC. I've got no O levels. I've got no A levels. I didn't go to a proper secondary school. I had only 18 months. You know, I just didn't meet the criteria. They were like, how old are you? I was like 26 at this point. I said, okay, you're a mature student, and looking at your performance, what you've done in your BTEC, on the basis of that, we'll give you a chance, but only if your subject tutors are willing to accept you. So I had to choose subjects that didn't have any science in them because I'd never done any sciences. I had to choose subjects that didn't require maths because I'd done some maths, but I didn't have a maths qualification. So I thought, right, what can I do? So American Studies was like top of the list because anyone can do that. It doesn't matter. You don't have to. It's like the most useless subject of all subjects. But it's a subject, so it counts. So I chose American Studies, and I thought, I might get a year out in America, go and see Gil. You know, it's great. So then I chose sociology because even though sociology is like a pretty useful subject, it's another one that you don't have to have done anything previously in. And then I thought, well, you know, I've worked on a farm for all these years and I've traveled the world. What about geography? So it all came down to like geography, what the geography tutor was going to say, whether I got in or whether I didn't. This is not in the book, actually. I don't think it's in the book.
I know, I'm like, wait, I don't
this is
like
you're going slightly off
like,
topic here.
This part.
So now I've got to meet this guy. His name's Jim Moore at Hope University, and he was like the senior tutor or whatever in the geography department. So he's like, hey, you got no qualifications in geography? And then he looked at me like that and he said, do I know you? And I was like, no. And he was like, what school did you go to? I said, why? He said, were you ever in Gattaca? So I'm sitting there going, oh shit. That was one of the schools that they'd sent me to home on trial. And after they put me in the third year, in the second year when I was a third year, and then halfway through the second year, they moved me up into the third year, which even put me more behind. And then it all went pear-shaped and I got expelled. And then they took me back into care again. That bit is in the book. But he was a tutor there, and he recognized me, but I couldn't admit it to him. So I was just like, no. So then he was like, he looked at me performances and all of that, and I said, look, I've done horticulture, and you know, I know how to do this, and I've built environments, and I know geopolitics, and I've traveled the world, and da-da-da. He went, okay, I'm going to give you a shot. And him giving me that shot enabled me to enter university and then to go through and do my degree. And I dropped American Studies in the first year after a tutor from the Midwest told me that slaves had it good because at least they had jobs when they were in slavery, and the Indians had it coming because of manifest destiny. If they hadn't been so hostile, they wouldn't have got wiped out. And I was just like, no. And then I carried on and I got my first degree in geography and sociology, but I only got a 2-2. But my starting point was subterranean. So when I come to go and do a master's, we're like, oh, you need a 2-1. So that was a whole other argument. And then when I come to do my PhD, it was like, we want to see your transcripts. Well, why your master's, but it's not with distinction, and your degree, it's only a 2-2. So my application to Cambridge was actually in the bin. But my tutor was like, no, it's got seminal research here, take it out the bin. So they took the top copy off, put it to academics, and then rated it highly. But when they're looking at the top copy, the tick box, you know, if you don't meet those criteria, you're not going to get the PhD, you're not going to get the entry, you're not going to get the funding. And this thing follows you through, and these are all the barriers that you face. And, you know, now I'm doing a lot of work to try and get those barriers lifted and to start getting academic institutions to try and see other ways that they can unlock the potential of people like me, instead of doing the tick box exercise for everyone who just had a very kind of TikTok life, you know, that went all the way through tickety-boo without any of those intersectional kind of disadvantages.
You know, me and Malik, I've interviewed and spoke to Malik a few times over the years. We've known each other, and I always say, every time I speak to Malik, it's impossible to get his story in because it's got so many corners and it's so fascinating. And we're already here now, we're near the end of this Q&A already. See,
well, you got 9 minutes.
Yeah. So we're going to open it up if there's anyone. And of course, everything Malik has spoken about is all in this book. He just got a little hidden little sneaky little something that's not in the bonus feature there. But if anyone has any questions that they'd like, we've got 2 here, one down the front and one at the back.
Can we just ask for the people to wait for the microphones, just because they're recording the event as well, so your question won't be recorded if you don't speak into the mic.
Yeah, you wouldn't have a chip on you now. You'd be called woke.
Did you ever called worse?
Well, probably. Did you ever admit to this guy that you remembered him?
I did, actually, on a field trip. We were out in the Yorkshire Moors or something. We were doing this like geography field trip, and all the kids, you know, we were all grown-up students or whatever, we all went to a pub in the evening and we're sitting down, and it's a very casual thing. And by this time, I'd got to know him. I think I'd done the first couple of terms. We were like 2/3 of the way through the first year, and he really liked me as a student, and I'd turned out some really good work. We sat down in the pub, and he was asking me, like, he was getting a bit probing because I think he never let it go that he knew. And then I just confessed, and I just said, yeah, actually, I'm sorry, I didn't admit to it at the time, but I was in Gattaca Comp, and I told him the whole story. And I won't go into the full details of the story because it will be a spoiler for some of the stuff that's in the book, but I told him the whole story of what happened at Gattaca and how I ended up getting expelled from Gattaca and what the consequences of that were for me. And I think if I told you that at this point, it would really spoil something which is really quite pivotal in the story. I would encourage people to look at the book to get the answer to that one. But suffice to say that when I told him, he recalled the conversations that had been going on in the staff room about me, the troubled black kid coming in from the care system that we should never have took, and now look what we've got to do with him. He literally put his head in his hands like this, and he apologized on behalf of the school and all the staff. You know, and we became great friends, and he's someone I have immense respect for, someone who I owe a great deal to, and you know, he respected me as well after that.
There was another question. Did you still? Yep, right at the back there. Thank you for your question as well.
You got one down here as well.
So previously you've said that Bob Dylan is the white Gil Scott-Heron.
Well,
Could you expand on that?
Well, people used to say Gil Scott-Heron was the black Bob Dylan, and it pissed me off, because I mean, okay, Dylan was a beat poet, you know what I mean, and they had the peace stance and all the rest of it, you know, and Gil, although he sort of had, you know, he was very much in the peace movement, he also aligned himself with the black arts movement, and if you know the history of that, the black arts movement was spearheaded by Amiri Baraka, otherwise known as Leroy Jones, as a black activist in the civil rights movement. And Leroy Jones, as Amiri Baraka, had taken a peaceful stance and was very much part of the whole thing with the beat poets. But when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were assassinated, he rejected his previous stance on that and formed the black arts movement, which then spawned the Last Poets, who were touring the college circuit when Gil Scott-Heron came out. So things like Niggers Are Scared of Revolution and When the Revolution Comes was all out of the Last Poets, who also became my mentors as well, and I talk about them in the book because I ended up working with those guys as well when I was kind of looking back to see who Gil's influences were, you know, and they were amongst them. So the idea then of taking someone like Gil Scott-Heron, who, yes, aligned with certain aspects of the beat poets, but also was very much driven by the works of the Last Poets and others from the Black Arts movement, which were very much more on the Malcolm X, much more direct action, confrontational. The Young Lords were born out of the Last Poets as well, which was the Latino movement that came out of Chicago with, and the New York chapter of it was Felipe Luciano, who was one of the original members of the Last Poets, and he left the Last Poets to form the New York chapter of the Young Lords, and they were the Latinos who were very much involved in direct action through arts and poetry. So it was, you know, to sort of then take someone like Gil Scott-Heron and his revolutionary stance and then try and sort of, you know, dumb it down to a kind of a Bob Dylan, you know, peace and love thing as if there was no revolution in there. It was like trying to take the sting out the bee. And also, it was also sort of trying to suggest that white is the normal and white is the standard against which everything else is measured, you know. So there was no equality in that. So that's why when people said to me, you know, Gil Scott-Heron is the black Bob Dylan, I would say, no, Bob Dylan was the white Gil Scott-Heron. And this lady had a question, did you have a question? Oh, one of you guys? Okay.
Have you managed to reconnect with your family?
To some degree. I mean, me and my mum are incredibly close. I was there today. She made me a cup of tea. Me and my mum, you know, really did have a difficult time to reconnect. For many years, we just didn't speak about it. It was just this elephant in the room that just never got discussed. But when I decided to sue Liverpool City Council for my time in care, for the physical abuse, the racial abuse, the solitary confinement, what they now call pin down, locking children behind doors without the requisite authority from the Secretary of State to do so. You know, at that point, when I launched that case in around 1992, same year I entered university, then I spent 10 years in that litigation. which I then won, and I got a public apology from the Lord Mayor of Liverpool, and a load of money. I mean, they offered me like £120,000 and a public apology from the from the city solicitor. And I was like, what's the city solicitor apologising for? You know, for dragging me through 10 years of litigation when they knew they were guilty as hell. I told them, take your 120 grand, stick it up your arse, and I'll see you in court. And the solicitor was like, you can't do that, Malik. If you go to court and lose, you've got £500,000 of legal costs. They've got £500,000 of legal costs. You'll be required to pay their legal costs and your own. You'll have to declare bankruptcy. And I said, I would rather declare bankruptcy than do that. So unless the Lord Mayor of Liverpool is going to apologise to me on town hall letterhead and it's going to go on public record, couldn't care less if they were offering me £1 million. It wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to me. So apparently the night before the trial, they were running around trying to find the Lord Mayor to see if he'd be the first Lord Mayor in history of the Mayorate to apologise publicly, and they couldn't find him. Ron Goulding it was at the time. They couldn't find him, so we went to court the next day. We were at the High Court in Manchester, and basically when we got to the court, the judge was sitting. It was Judge Michael Morland, the one who heard the Naomi Campbell chocolate soldier case, and also the one who'd adjudicated the James Bulger case. So we got in front of the judge, and then just before he was about to start the trial, the barrister for the other side came in and they said, we found the Lord Mayor and he's willing to apologise. But because the judge was sitting, they couldn't do an out-of-court settlement, which is what the council wanted to do. Because if it's an out-of-court settlement, the terms of the settlement are not known to anyone, and the evidence that you procure cannot be used, and there's no finding of fact in the case, so there's no legal precedent. But what had happened in this case was, because the judge was already sitting, it became an in-court settlement rather than an out-of-court settlement. So I actually got a judgment, which meant that all the other 200 kids who had been in a class action following behind me were able to rely upon my evidence. And I got my 120 grand, and I got my public apology from the Lord Mayor on town hall letterhead. So my solicitor at that point said, the fight's over, Malik. He said, there's no point in going through this trial, just take it, and we've got the best of both worlds. So I accepted that judgment, and that was the settlement of it. And then I took the money, formed my own company, and took the poetry that I'd used to learn to read and write, that I used to send in letters to Gil, and he used to appraise it. And I published it in a volume of poetry called Ordinary Guy, self-published through my own publishing company in 2004, when I was Mark T. Watson, before I converted to Islam and became Malik Al Nasir. So anyone's looking for it, Ordinary Guy, Mark T. Watson, that's my first volume of poetry.
On that note, I believe we're going to have to finish up. If there is anyone that does want to ask any more questions of Malik, he's going to be down with his book, Letters to Go, which is going to be there as well, also available, which I'm sure you'll be willing to sign for people.
Yeah, I'll be signing books down there. Yeah.
So, with that being said, big thanks to Malik Al Nasir for being here with us. Absolutely amazing.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, man.